Great, thanks, Karen. Hope everybody can see that. So first, a huge word of thanks to Karen, to Aaron and Dan, all the preparatory work that's gone into the call today, and for this opportunity to talk to you about one of my great passions and one of my great loves. My name is Mike Hoffmann. I'm based at the Zoological Society of London. I head up our wildlife recovery programs. I've been here for about 4.5 years. But before coming to ZSL, I worked for IUCN for about a decade. And it was really during that period of time that I spent a huge amount of my life with the IUCN Red List, both doing assessments, but also driving forward a lot of the sort of the conceptual strategy and thinking around the Red List. And so it's great to be able to have the opportunity to talk to you today about the IUCN Red List. Obviously, there is a huge amount of ground we could cover. We've only got an hour, so we have to be somewhat focused in what we can actually talk about. You know, the realistic thing is that this is an initiative that has a very long history and is always constantly moving in new directions. So we're going to try and cover a lot, but also necessarily we kind of have to scrape the surface a little bit. But as much as I can throughout the presentation, I'm going to point you to a few additional references and resources that you can use if you want to find out more. I should probably also provide a bit of a qualifier that I'm going to make references to invertebrates, but it's probably going to be the least invertebrate focused talk in this series. That's partly because I want to also drive home the message of the relevance of the Red List for biodiversity writ large, not just for invertebrates. But I am going to use a few invertebrate examples here and there. So hopefully it won't be too far off track from what where you're going to be hearing through the rest of this, what looks like a really great series of talks. Okay, so let's move to the first thing that I'd like to do, which is just do a little bit of a poll, and I think Karen's going to take the lead on this one.
Yeah, just to let everybody know, so that's popped up now. You've got 2 questions, so you might need to scroll down or change the size of the box to answer it all. I'm going to give you a minute, so 15 seconds have gone. We've got a minute to get through it all. So the first question is just asking if you've used the IUCN Red List for anything before in the last 3 years. Yes, no, or what the hell is the IUCN thing? I'm at the wrong webinar. So far, we've got nobody saying that. Brilliant. That's all good. If you have said yes, the question below asks you what you used it for. You can select more than one thing. So if you selected it for multiple reasons, then please do select multiple things. If you've used it for anything else, so if you've used the data on there to create a wonderful piece of artwork, for example, something we couldn't conceive that you might have used it for, then do click other and let us know in the chat. It's really interesting for us and for Mike to see how people use the IUCN Red List in maybe even in less conventional ways. So yeah, I'm going to close that poll now and hand back to Mike.
That's brilliant, thanks, and thank you to everybody for engaging there. So not too surprisingly, a pretty good proportion of you, I mean the majority of you have used it for something in the past 3 years. Thankfully, none of you said that you're in the wrong webinar. That's an excellent start for the session. And of course, a really nice mix of kind of uses there. I mean, pretty much what we normally see, a real mix of people who are using it for education purposes, maybe the kids or whatever who have school projects and they're going to the Red List website to consult it. Of course, many of you are probably consulting it in your work or for research purposes. And then of course, you know, there's the good old personal interest, which also matches with some of the expressions that we saw there from from why people were interested in joining this this webinar in the first instance. So really interesting. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk just quickly. What are we going to talk about in this talk? So the first thing, I've kind of divided it up into four modules, if you like. In the first one, we're going to just take a little bit of a step back, sort of 50,000 foot view. What is the IUCN Red List? What's its purpose? What's its function? What's it intended to do? What's it not intended to do? Those sorts of things. Then we'll do a little bit more of a deep dive into how does a species actually get on the red list? And it's in that part of the talk where we'll get a little bit more into the categories and the criteria, which are kind of the crux of the way that the whole system works. We definitely will not go into that at great depth, and I'll explain why when we get into that session. But we will touch on it so that at least you leave with a little bit of an idea for how the categories and criteria work and for how species actually can be included in assessment on the red list. Then we'll talk a little bit about how the red list is produced, who does it, what happens, who's responsible, all the rest of it. And then finally, we'll have a session on how you actually use the Red List website. And that will just be a very short tutorial. If time permits, we'll also do a session, we'll take a few slides just to tell you a little bit about the IUCN Green Status of Species, which in fact has just launched today. But let's see how we go time-wise anyway. Okay, so let's start, I guess, with some basics with what is the IUCN Red List. And Karen, I'm going to come to you again for a quick little quiz number one, if you're amenable to bring that up. So 3 questions for everybody to run through there. No right or wrong answers, entirely confidential. But yeah, over to you guys to take a stab at answering there.
Not just confidential, Mike, it's actually anonymous, so we can't see who's answered what. So there's absolutely no reason to not have a go at it. It's really useful to give us an understanding of what your initial knowledge of the system is. But yeah, so completely anonymous. We'll give you another 20 seconds. There are 3 questions there, if you can try and answer them all. And they're all single options, so yeah, just one of the options on each answer. So yeah, the questions are asking when the red list was first conceived, what does red listed mean on a red list, and what the primary purpose of a red list is. Right, I think, yeah, we've got majority of people have answered there, Mike, so I'm going to end the poll. Mike, would you like me to share the results, or would you rather, yeah?
No, if you could share them with everybody, that'd be great. I will come back to them in about 6 or 7 slides. So I'm just going to make a quick little note there, just to remind myself of.
While you're making that note, Mike, just particularly for the recording, I'll explain what we've got. So for question 1, the most popular answer for red lists were conceived of in the 1970s was the option that 37% of people opted for. Question 2, on the red list or red listed means, and the most popular option there was a species has been assessed by IUCN and included on the red list. And then for the primary purpose of the red list, the options were to categorize species according to their risk of extinction in the wild. Option 2 was to prioritize species for conservation action. And option 3 was both of the above. And it was option 3 on that 3rd question that was the most popular. So back to you, Mike.
Thank you, Karen. Brilliant. Okay, so as I said, I'm not going to give you the answers to that yet. Rather, let's get stuck in, and probably some of the answers will reveal themselves as we go through the presentation. So, okay, so what is the red list? Well, in short, it's the most comprehensive tool for assessing the status of species around the world. It aims to identify species at risk of extinction in the wild. That is its primary reason for being. And it has this incredible reputation for being credible partly because it's housed under the auspices of IUCN, which is an intergovernmental organization that has a very long history for being science-based and fact-based. It's very trusted and it's science-based, and it has a very long history. So in fact, the Red Lists were first conceived of in the early 1960s. They were conceived of by a gentleman by the name of Sir Peter Scott, who's probably familiar to many of you. He, of course, helped found the WWF, and he's the person who kind of helped design its famous panda logo. And of course, when the Red Lists were originally designed, they were mostly built to kind of draw attention to the plight of wild species of flora and fauna. And so that picture at the top right there shows what the very early prototype Red List looked like, which is that they were basically a loose leaf binder of leaflets that were issued. And so there'd be one on the panda or one on the snow leopard or whatever. And then the idea was that they would be, oops, sorry, this seems to be automatically fast forwarding. They would automatically be, when they were revised, you would take the old leaflet out, you'd throw it away, and you'd replace it with a new one in the binder. But of course, that all changed in the 2000s with the advent of the internet, which led to the first Red List website being launched in 2000. And at the same time, that was really the point at which the Red List entered the 21st century. And of course, the Red List has changed quite considerably over the 60, 70 years that it's been in existence. But the bottom line is that it is a tool that is renowned for this credibility and this reliability, and hence the reasons that it's used for all of the reasons that many of you indicated in your responses to the quiz. Now, there are lots of misperceptions that remain out there around the Red List. One of these, unfortunately, is not helped in the fact that the Red List is called the Red List of Threatened Species, and yet despite its name, it's actually not just about threatened species. In fact, the Red List includes all species, regardless of extinction risk. And it's true that when the Red Data books were originally conceived of in the early 1960s, they were seen as this kind of register of threatened wildlife, with the purpose being to kind of flag up those species that were at risk of extinction. And the Red Lists at the time were definitely a bit less concerned with collating information on what we kind of know as being common or widespread species. But the Red Lists of today are quite different. Don't get me wrong, the Red List obviously still has many biases, including obviously to invertebrates, but it does aim to cover all species, regardless of whether they are threatened or not. And this is really, I think, pretty well conveyed in this figure on the right-hand side. This is a graph taken from the most recent Red List website, which shows not only the increasing coverage of threatened species over time, certainly since the year 2000, when the website was launched, but also the number of all species assessed. And therefore, when people say that a species is on the Red List or Red List, it really can only mean that it has been assessed by IUCN as included on the Red List website, not that the species is necessarily threatened. Unfortunately, a lot of people do use this terminology. They say, oh, well, a species is red listed or a species is on the Red List. And when they use it in that way, they often mean it to convey that a species is threatened. But it's extremely misleading because of the fact that the Red List includes these species that are actually not threatened, but may actually be relatively widespread and common. So in general, actually, IUCN encourages and advises people not to use that terminology. The other thing I want to mention with this graph on the right is that you can see the number of species on the y-axis, which shows the total number of assessments that are now rapidly approaching 140,000 species. And I guess just out of interest sake, it'd be useful to see for people just to throw into the chat. So as a proportion of all described species globally, all species that have actually been formally described, what percentage do you think that is? What percentage do you think that is actually represented on the Red List and assessed on the Red List? Don't think about it too much. Just throw something in the chat as a percentage. Just kind of be interested to see what folks think.
So we've got things like 10%, 2%, 17%, quite a variety really, 5%.
Okay, very good. I guess the interesting thing is everybody kind of understands that relatively speaking, it's quite a small proportion. It's not a very high proportion. In fact, in reality, it's about 6 or 7%, because the total number of described species is, roughly 1.9 million, somewhere around there. So roughly 6 to 7% of species are actually of described species on the Red List. So there's a long way to go. The Red List coverage is certainly growing, both taxonomically and geographically, but obviously there is some way to go in terms of getting to that, having full coverage. And in reality, it will probably never get to that point. But the Red List has kind of set a benchmark figure of 160,000 that it calls, or that it figures would be a good barometer of life. Now, this brings me to another point, which is that the Red List is not just about whether species are threatened or not, but it's also about all species. Now, in years gone by, the Red List did have a lot of these biases in terms of the taxa that were represented. They tended to be more geared toward birds and mammals and other charismatic vertebrates, which was a bit of a reflection on the kind of opportunistic way that Red List assessments were done in the past. But that has changed quite dramatically, and along with that growth of species that are represented on the Red List in the past 2 decades, there's been quite a huge improvement in coverage across much lesser known taxa, including in aquatic groups and plants and invertebrates. And this means that we're actually now starting to get a much better understanding of how extinction risk compares between groups. So in this figure, for example, which is also taken from the Red List website, you can see that a group like cycads, which is at the bottom, has a much higher proportion of species that are threatened with extinction. And what I mean there are the species that are critically endangered, and vulnerable, those that are in yellow, orange, and red, than, for example, say birds, which only have about 8% for species that are threatened with extinction. And in case you're wondering what that red line means, that basically is just giving you a best estimate of the true proportion of threatened species if we assume that all data deficient species, which is those that are represented by the gray section, were threatened in the same proportion as data sufficient species. And remember that this is only possible because, as we've just discussed in that previous slide, IUCN is now comprehensively assessing all species within a taxonomic group. So without that, you would have no knowledge of this. You wouldn't be able to say that 25% of mammals are threatened with extinction, because you wouldn't have assessed all the mammals in your taxonomic group. And you also wouldn't have a baseline from which to assess change over time. So in summary, the coverage of the Red List is improving, and yes, there are certainly biases in terms of coverage for groups like plants and invertebrates, but in coming years, we can expect many of those biases to be eroded as a lot more of these big global assessments take place. Now, red listing is about much more than just a category of extinction risk. So, there's this kind of conception out there that the red list is just basically a list of threat categories, CR, EN, and that's all that's important. But the real utility of the red list as a conservation tool also derives from the classification of species into not just into this category of threat, but also from this huge wealth of information that is collected to support the red list assessment. And this includes information on distribution and population trends and habitat preferences and the threats that are operating in the range of the species and the conservation actions. And much of this is then categorized or classified into what we call classification schemes, which then allow users like yourselves to go to the Red List website and to do various analyses or queries of data. And we might have some time to do that later. We also compiled a distribution map in GIS, example there in the bottom right-hand corner. This is an example of a invertebrate species which has been mapped to water basins. And these maps are extremely important because not only do they give the users a good idea of the range of the species and the distribution of it, but they also allow us to perform some important analyses that help us better understand patterns of distribution and threat. And I'll give an example of that in a bit. Importantly, any assessment on the red list must comply with certain minimum documentation requirements, although there is also a recommended level of documentation. Sorry, this is very annoying having had this automatic slide enhancement thing going on. There's a recommended level of documentation that IUCN strongly encourages assessors to conform to. But the key thing is to know there's this minimum set, and if those are not met, then a red list assessment cannot be included on the red list website. And of course, the whole reason we do all of this is because it ensures transparency and repeatability. It means that in 5 years' time, when somebody comes to reassessing a species, they understand what an assessor did and why they determined that a species was critically endangered or endangered. But it also means that it's you as the user who goes to the red list website can fully understand what is the rationale for the listing of the species. And so this is something that's really been pretty important to the development of the red list over the last 20 years in particular. Now, the red list has a particular remit, which is that it undertakes assessments at the global level across the entire range of the species. Sometimes it also includes assessments done at a regional level, but this is largely limited to a few regions like Europe and the Mediterranean, usually places where there are particular policy instruments in place that can draw on the information that is contained within those assessments. The red list can include assessments for subspecies, for subpopulations, and for varieties in the case of plants, but there has to be a species level parent assessment in place. Without that, it's not possible for a subspecies or a subpopulation to be assessed. The important thing to be aware of, though, is that many countries also undertake assessments at a national level. Sometimes these countries use the IUCN system for doing this, and in this case, they follow a set of guidelines that IUCN have developed for applying at the criteria at a national level. Those are the ones in the bottom right there. And what this means is that some species can actually have multiple assessments. So the mole cricket, as an example in the top right, which was previously, historically widespread in Britain and is now largely confined to the New Forest, at least within the UK, is assessed as critically endangered. But outside of the UK, at least in the European region, the species is widespread, and so it's listed as least concern. There's no global assessment for the species, and yet if there were, it would almost certainly be listed as least concern. And so you've basically got multiple different categories for the same species, but all at different scales of assessment. I guess the most important thing to keep in mind is that these national assessments are not endorsed by IUCN. Okay, so IUCN does not provide any endorsement or approval of them. It does provide training, and it does provide these guidelines that I've referred to in the right here. But otherwise, the responsibility for delivering these assessments sits with national authorities. Finally, the last thing to emphasize is that the red list is not a priority setting tool. So it has a very wide set of uses and applications, but it should never be used in isolation for setting priorities. Now, it's true red list data are often misused or sometimes inappropriately used, usually with the best of intentions by conservationists and decision makers and others. But for the most part, IUCN tries to provide good advice on how to avoid such cases. I've given this interesting, very topical example that some of you may be familiar with, which is the recent quinquennial review of Schedules 5 and 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act, which recently has drawn quite a lot of attention because of this clause that species that are listed as nationally vulnerable or near threatened or least concerned should no longer be eligible for listing on the schedules. This is not uncommon where countries tie a legislative response to the listing a national red list assessment. Unfortunately, it's usually not to be encouraged. It's the sort of thing that IUCN strongly discourages because, among other things, it's important to think about what the benefits will be conferred to the species based on the particular legislative response that is being considered. And there are many, many other examples of where this has happened in the past. But I guess the key thing to say is that there are also lots of good examples of where the red list is used correctly and appropriately, often with other kinds of data. So just to give you some examples, this is a chart of what we call the Red List Index. It is a widely used monitoring approach that tracks changes, genuine changes in extinction risk over time, and has been instrumental in helping and supporting monitoring of some of these big internationally agreed conventions and targets, including for the Convention on Biological Diversity and for the Sustainable Development Goals. This is obviously just showing 5 Red List indices for 5 different groups, but there are many other groups that are currently in preparation. And it's only possible when there are repeat assessments of species over time. Earlier, I mentioned the power and the utility of range maps for allowing us to understand better distributions of species and patterns of threat. This is from an analysis that was published some years ago now, looking at patterns of distribution of highly threatened mammal species, basically showing the highly concentrated nature of threat to mammals in the Southeast Asia region, where of course they're dealing with the double whammy of habitat loss and hunting. In the top right is an example of an analysis that was done trying to identify very highly threatened species, critically endangered and endangered species around the world that are known to have their populations, their entire populations, confined to one single site. So basically, if those sites were lost, the species would go extinct. And the red dots represent sites that are unprotected, yellow, those dots that are protected. And you can see a huge concentration of sites, of course, primarily in the tropics, mostly in island and highland regions. And then final example, one I'm quite proud of, it's a program line close to my heart at ZSL called the Edge of Existence program, which brings together information on threat and also on phylogenetic diversity to ask what are the most highly threatened branches on the tree of life, and then try to prioritize those species for conservation action. So those are just some of the ways and some of the examples in which Red List data have been used in the past. There are obviously many, many other examples. And so coming back to our quiz that we started off with, well, Red Lists were first conceived of in the 1960s. Well done to everyone who got that right. I realize there's that logo in the top left-hand corner saying guided conservation for 50 years. That may have led some of you to put in 1970s there. Admittedly, it's a little outdated, that logo now. It probably should say guiding conservation for 60 years. On the Red List or red listed means a species has been assessed by IUCN and included on the Red List. It does not mean that a species is threatened, but as I said, in general, best to avoid those terms. If you want to reference that a species is threatened on the Red List, say a species is threatened on the Red List. That's the best way forward. And the primary purpose of the Red List is to categorize species according to their risk of extinction in the wild. It is not for prioritization, although the information can be used to support the prioritization of species conservation globally. So again, very good to everybody who got those questions right. And we will now move on to the second module, which is where we're kind of going to get into the nitty-gritty. And I'm going to come to Kieran again to bring up quiz 2 with a second set of questions.
So again, these are all anonymous, so we can't see who's writing what. And these are all true or false. So we've got 3 statements, and we need you to tell us whether you think they are true or false. So the first one is a species with a very small range is automatically threatened on the Red List. Is that true or false? Question 2, IUCN follows the precautionary principle and hence species that might be extinct are immediately listed as such. True or false? And finally, the Red List system does not need good quality data and can be used on poorly known species. True or false? That's something that I'm particularly interested in at the end because my interest is earthworms and we have very little data on earthworms. So how useful could the Red List be for them? So I look forward to finding out from you, Mike, what that might be. I'm just going to give you 10 more seconds. So if you haven't submitted your answers, you need to do it straight away. like I said before, it's anonymous. We don't know what you've put, but it's good to get an idea of what people's perception is. It's certainly, I'm going to share the results now. Some of the questions seem to be more polarized than others there, Mike. So I'm going to hand back to you now.
Great, thank you, Kieran. And again, great. Thank you so much to everybody who participated there. So I'm gonna answer those again through the course of this next session, and I will of course come back to them right at the end. But yeah, really nice to see the spread there. Some interesting answers. Okay, so give me a second. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about how species get onto the red list. So the first thing to kind of say is what is eligible for listing on the red list. And basically, red list assessments are open to all species except the following. If it's a subglobal assessment, it cannot be included. So any national assessments, as we've already discussed, are not included on the red list website. And most regional assessments are not included on the red list website. Some exceptions, usually Europe and the Mediterranean. Hybrid species are out. Hybrid individuals, different story. Hybrid individuals of a particular species can be included, but hybrid species may not be included. Domesticated taxa, Felis catus, etc., these sorts of things are not included on the red list. Any species that has gone extinct before 1500 AD is excluded. Anything that went extinct after that point in time may be included. Undescribed species, we do make some exceptions for those to be allowed, but for the most part, we don't encourage it. And where we do allow it, there are usually some very, very strict criteria, including the fact that there needs to almost be a publication in press. Obviously, we don't include higher taxa. And then there are some other conditions. For example, we don't usually include managed or introduced populations. So obviously individuals that are sitting in zoos or in very, very captive or managed populations are not included within the scope of a red list assessment. So there are some general predefined parameters here that dictate what can and can't be included. But of course, the number one thing that controls the whole system is what we call the red list categories and criteria. So basically, in order to get on the red list, a species has to be assessed according to this rigorous system of categories and criteria. This is very different to the way that the very first red list assessments were done in the 60s and the 70s, which arguably relied much more on the experience and common sense of experts, and probably without following much in the way of any protocols or criteria. And for this reason, we're quite prone to subjectivity. But with this increasing use of the red list during the 1980s and the 90s in particular, and this recognized growth in the use of red list assessments themselves for informing conservation, it was clear that we needed to bring in a more rigorous set of quantitative and rigorous criteria. The first set of those were proposed in 1991 in this very seminal publication by the late Georgina Mace and Russ Landy. Those criteria were then adopted in 1994, and then a revised version of them were published in 2001, which is that little booklet you see on the right-hand side there. And those have formed the basis for every single assessment that has been published on the red list since. There are a couple that still use the old version, but very, very few. And the key thing to say is that these criteria are highly, highly, highly unlikely to change at any time or any point in the immediate future. And there are a suite of reasons for that, but which I won't go into here. So these are what we call the categories that you see in front of you here. There are 8 categories of threat, all with kind of increasing risk of extinction. Obviously, right at the top, we start with the 2 extinct categories. Extinct, obviously, those species for which there is absolutely no reasonable doubt that the species is gone and does not survive on the planet. Extinct in the wild, basically for the same, but the species may survive in captivity. There are then the 3 threatened categories: critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. All with slightly increasing elements of extinction risk associated with them. and with certain criteria and thresholds that need to be met to qualify. We then have the category near threatened, which is for species that come close to meeting the threatened categories but don't quite meet them. The category of least concern, which is for what we might call our generally widespread, common, not declining species. I guess important to say that least concern species may be declining. It's not to suggest that there is absolutely no risk at all to them. They may be declining and they may eventually move into other categories of threat, but at least at this point in time, or at the point in time in which they're assessed, they are not considered to be at high risk of extinction in the wild. And finally, there's the category of data deficient, which is where you really do not have sufficient information to hand in order to make a reliable determination as to whether or not a species can be placed into one of the other categories of threat. Now, as I said, in order to be listed in one of those threatened categories, critically endangered, or vulnerable, you have to meet at least one of a series of criteria. And these criteria are handily, alphabetically organized, A, B, C, D, and E. And they relate very broadly to a few key fundamentals that relate to increased risk of extinction in species. And those include population reduction, species having very restricted geographic range size, populations or species having small population size and undergoing decline, species that have very, very small or restricted populations, and then criterion E, which we won't go into at all in the course of this talk, which is basically a quantitative analysis. Of course, for each of these criteria, there are set quantitative thresholds that have to be met in order to be eligible for listing as threatened. And then sitting underneath those quantitative thresholds, there are a bunch of sub-criteria that usually also have to be met. So what we're going to do in the next couple of slides is unpack that a little bit. Before we do that, I just want to highlight a couple of things. So first is that there are also rules for determining when a species is extinct or extinct in the wild. This is something that's not commonly understood. It's often felt that, oh, well, we just list a species as extinct when it hasn't been seen in 50 years or 60 years or 70 years or whatever. That is not the case. There are many examples of species that have been gone or been missing for many, many decades, and then suddenly, whoops, somebody goes and looks for them and they're rediscovered. And of course, if the Red List has said they're extinct and they're rediscovered, well, that's not great for credibility of the Red List. So there are and this is just one of this kind of reputational risk is one of the risks of incorrectly listing a species either as extinct when it's still alive or as still alive when it's really still extinct. And at top right, there is a bird species called the Cebu flowerpecker. A gentleman by the name of Nigel Collar at BirdLife International coined the term the Romeo era based on the species because many, many years ago, conservationists gave up on the species. It occurs on a small island in the Philippines called Cebu. They gave up on it because they thought that there were too many threats and there was no habitat remaining. And then lo and behold, a couple of years later, somebody who was out there in the area discovered the species still surviving, and magically the species came back from the dead. But of course, in all of that intervening years, conservationists had given up on it. And of course, inadvertently, fortunately, this didn't happen, but inadvertently, it could have really led to the real extinction of the species. So IUCN has some very clear and distinct criteria for how to determine when a species is extinct or extinct in the wild, and those ask important questions about the number of surveys that have been done and what threats are operating in the range. And in fact, many species that are critically endangered receive a special flag called possibly extinct, which is really to try and highlight these species that may be gone, but for which there may still be some hope that the species still survives. And I think there are about 1,100 such species listed on the Red List. In fact, more of those species on the Red List website than there are extinct species at the moment. Before we get into the criteria as well, the other thing to say is that the Red List has its own terminology. We're not going to go through all of this. I've put some of the terms on the right there. These are extremely important to understand if you want to apply the Red List categories and criteria. because it's often very different to the way that we use these terms in general biology. Generation length, location, mature individuals, even population, they mean very different things sometimes in a red list sense than to the way we might use them in our everyday conversation. And yet they are extremely important to understanding and correctly applying the categories and criteria. And of course, some of these different criteria are used in, some of these different concepts are used in different criteria. So for example, extent of occurrence is important if you want to apply criteria A, C, and D. A, B, and D. I don't know why I've put C there, but anyway. So let's just take a look at one of these. This is extent of occurrence, which is, in the red list sense of the word, defined as the area contained within the shortest continuous imaginary boundary, which can be drawn to encompass all the known, inferred, or projected sites of a present occurrence of a taxon, excluding cases of vagrancy. Now, basically, extent of occurrence is a measure of the spread of risks. So all else being equal, two subpopulations of a species that are far apart have a much greater spread of risk than two subpopulations that occur very close together, especially if there's a threatening process that could very easily wipe out those subpopulations. So it is not a measure of range, and it is almost always measured by means of a minimum convex polygon around those sites of occurrence. So in that example in the map at top there, where you can see a bunch of records from Western Australia in green, basically all they've done is drawn a polygon, a minimum convex polygon around the outer known sites of occurrence, and that polygon, that shaded gray area, is equivalent to the extent of occurrence. And that's quite easy, you know, that seems relatively straightforward, but it's clearly quite different to range. If we were doing a range map in a field guide, we'd probably have more kind of fudgy borders and all the rest of it. That's very different to this map, which is doing exactly the same, but you'll notice that you've got these records spanning continents here, and yet we've got ocean in between. And that doesn't matter. From a red list point of view, the fact that there is ocean in between doesn't matter, because the ocean is contributing to this spread of risk. The ocean is helping as part of this theoretical concept of the fact that risks to the species, or a threat to the species in the northern part of South America, is highly, highly unlikely to also operate in the Florida coast. And so this is a really key thing to understand in the red list parlance, that these different concepts all have very, very particular uses and applications, and are absolutely fundamental if you want to use the categories and criteria correctly. Okay, so let's do a bit of a deep dive. This is what we call part of the cheat sheet, which is a highly summarized version of the categories and criteria. I'm not going to go into this in any detail. I just kind of want to unpack it a little bit for you. We've already spoken about the categories, right? So you've got critically endangered, endangered, and vulnerable. We'll focus a little bit here on the category endangered. We've already spoken about criteria, right? So you've got A, C, D, and we're going to focus here on criterion B, which is geographic range. And I've also mentioned to you that you've got these thresholds, right? So these are the thresholds that you need to meet in order to warrant or become eligible for listing in a threatened category. So if you want to be, if your species is likely to be less than 5,000 kilometers squared in terms of its extent of occurrence, then it is eligible for listing as endangered in the red list categories and criteria. But you also have to meet certain sub-criteria. And this is the key bit that many people forget about. It's not enough to just have a small distribution size. It's not enough to just have a very small population, right? It's a very small population. You also need to meet a number of sub-criteria. And the reason is that if those sub-criteria were not in place, then you would probably just have a whole bunch of species that have very small distribution ranges threatened on the red list, even though many of them have no real threats operating for them and may be increasing in population size. So these sub-criteria are really, really crucial to the correct application of the system. And again, you'll see all of that language that we've just discussed is highlighted throughout. So we've got extent of occurrence, area of occupancy, severely fragmented locations. All of these things are fundamental to the way that you apply the categories and criteria. And without knowing and understanding what each of those terms means, it becomes extremely difficult to apply the system. So stepping through it, just to give you, just to explain a little bit more, if we have a species that has an extent of occurrence of less than 5,000 kilometers squared, it therefore becomes eligible for listing as endangered under B1. If it's severely fragmented or has a limited number of locations of less than 5, it then triggers subcriterion A. And if there's a continuing decline in, let's say, extent of occurrence and the number of mature individuals, it therefore meets subcriterion B. And that's what all this funky syntax means, where you see at the end of the red list categories, there are all these criteria, and sometimes they can be very, very lengthy. Those are basically telling you which are the criteria that have been met, that the species has qualified for according to the red list categories and criteria. The only other thing to mention, of course, is that there are some other phrases here that have particular meaning: observed, estimated, inferred, or projected. Now, these words basically have to do with data quality. So a key element of the way that the system is designed is to be able to incorporate poor or incomplete data. Why? Because the reality is that there are only a small handful of species that we have complete data for. So the system allows you to incorporate the use of inference and suspicion and projection and so forth to allow taxa to be assessed even in the absence of perfect knowledge. The only thing is that it does ask you to be transparent about how you have done this. For example, if you've observed a decline based on a census of the population, or if you've inferred it based on, say, habitat loss, then you need to state that in your assessment so that it's transparent and clear what the basis of your data is. Now, of course, we also have to deal with a huge amount of uncertainty in assessments. Sometimes available data are unclear, and we're using different population estimates, and these can all yield very, very different results. The way the red list works is to allow you to reflect this uncertainty by stating the range of plausible categories that may apply, although it does ask you to make a choice. And so in doing so, assessors have to indicate their attitude to risk, although the key thing is that they must not be overly precautionary. So if you're not sure, maybe a species is critically endangered or endangered, that's fine. You can say it may be endangered or critically endangered. You're going to have to pick one of them, and then you're going to have to state why you're doing that. That is absolutely allowed and absolutely permissible in the red list system. Of course, sometimes your uncertainty is so great that you don't know if a species is critically endangered or least concern. And in that cases, you would actually just apply the category of data deficient. Now, species have to be assessed against all the criteria, not just any one. So you don't just go, yeah, well, it clearly meets A, my job's done, I can move on to the next species. No, you have to assess it against A, B, C, D, and E. And in most cases, that's actually very, very simple, because you immediately know, oh, well, the range is too big, it can't meet B, or the population is too large, it can't meet A, or it can't meet C, but it can meet B. It's usually quite a relatively straightforward thing. A species is always placed in the highest category in which it qualifies. I've given this example at the right here, just to give, this is the blue-billed curassow, because BirdLife helpfully indicate the categories and criteria that are met below the highest category. So you can see it's clearly critically endangered under criterion A, but it also meets all these other criteria under category, the endangered category, and all these additional criteria under the vulnerable category. And these criteria are important. Usually people, when they're talking about the red list or when they're giving categories in that, they just give the category but nothing else. But the criteria do give useful information. So in this example, the A tells you that the species is declining. The D, the subcriterion, tells you that the species is probably hunted because there's a loss of mature individuals, or perhaps there's some other reason, but it's almost certainly hunting. And the D tells you that there are less than 1,000 mature individuals. So just those few criteria give you this additional information without you even needing to read anything else. They tell you a few key things about the species. And unfortunately, it usually does get lost in the lingo. And of course, species are ideally reassessed every 10 years or so. they become marked as needs updating after every 10 years. In reality, some species don't get reassessed every 10 years, but that is obviously the ideal. There are some common concerns we hear. The criteria don't work for my species is poorly known, and we don't have enough information. It could be this, it could be that. Least concern doesn't reflect the status of the species where I'm working on them. The answers to these are usually the same, certainly whenever I do assessments and work with people on them. In answer to the criteria don't work for my species, I can promise you they do. They have been used for everything from fungi to butterflies to mammals to corals. They have very, very wide application. There are plenty of examples of how the criteria have been applied. And whenever you come across something that you're not sure of, there is usually somebody who can help you and step you through some examples of what they've done. Obviously, a common one is my species is poorly known and I don't have enough information. Well, you probably know more than you think. You don't need to have perfect information, but you probably know more than you think, in the sense of being able to infer based on habitat loss, and in terms of being able to draw on other information from other species that may co-occur in the region, or even conspecifics and congenerics. There's various information sources you can draw on that can help you make some determinations about where and how best to place a species. When you're not sure if there are multiple categories that could apply, well, that's just uncertainty. Yes, if you're not sure because it could be critically endangered or LC, yeah, that's a legitimate case of a species being data deficient. But more often than not, it's a case of a species being placed in either near threatened or vulnerable or endangered, and an assessor just not being sure which is the most appropriate category to apply. And as I say, that is just uncertainty, and there are ways around that. And then lastly, least concern doesn't reflect the status of species while I'm working on them. Well, that's okay. There are options. Sure, it might be least concern globally and very threatened where you are. Well, there are options where you can do subpopulation assessments on the Red List website. You can also do national assessments, as takes place here in the UK. And of course, the new Green Status of Species assessment approach, which is launched today, will also help introduce a bit more understanding of the heterogeneity of risk across species distribution range. So coming back to our questions and the quiz, a species with a very small range is automatically threatened on the Red List. I think most of you said false, and that is indeed correct. A species with a small range can be eligible for listing in a threatened category, but it must also meet certain sub-criteria. For the second question, I think, again, most of you got this correct. So IUCN follows the precautionary principle, and species that might be extinct are immediately listed as such. That is false. There are a bunch of key considerations that need to be factored in there, and there is a special flag that can be used. And the answer to the third one, the Red List system does not need good quality data and can be used on poorly known species. I think a number of you, well, I think the majority of you said false. The answer is very much true. We will leave it there. I'm going to do a quick time check because we've got about 5 minutes to 4, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly bounce us to the Red List website itself. I think I've stopped sharing. Did I?
Yeah, just to let you know, Mike, it's actually 23 minutes to 4, so we've got a while yet anyway. But yeah, I know you want to do a quick site tour of the Red List. I have put a couple of links, so feel free to bring that up, Mike, and I'll just talk while you're doing that. Okay. I have put a couple of links in the chat, extra links for people. So I've put a link to that cheat sheet, which is known officially as the Red List criteria summary sheet. Not surprising they haven't officially called it the cheat sheet. And I also put a link to where you can download the categories and criteria document as well.
Thanks, Karen. Okay, so I'm going to just move us on to just to give you a quick peruse of the Red List itself, just for those of you who've not used it or maybe had some wonderings about how best to use it. But I guess before I do that, I just want to also clarify a few things. So the Red List, as I said in the beginning of my talk, is primarily focused on global assessments. If you are looking for national level assessments, so the assessments that are conducted by the various national level authorities here in the UK, for example, which is primarily organized and coordinated by JNCC, then you need to go to the JNCC website. I think Erin's going to pop that into the chat for you. These are largely available as downloadable spreadsheets. Sometimes they're published in separate publications and papers, and you can kind of get a list of species and categories. But they're not at the moment contained in a database, a searchable database or anything like that. There are plans, however, to make them available via that website on the bottom left. This is a website that we actually host at ZSL called nationalredlist.org. It is in, I should very quickly warn you, it is in the throes of being redesigned and rebuilt from the ground up. So it's not terribly useful at the moment, but the idea is basically to provide a forum for serving up national level Red List assessments, including those from within the United Kingdom. And that is a useful place if you're looking to see what Red Lists have been published nationally, not just in the UK, but also further afield. It's the kind of place you can go to access that information. But at the moment, if you want those that have been published in the UK, and there are quite a few, you will need to go to the JNCC site. Obviously, if you want global Red List assessments, then the IUCN Redlist.org site is your go-to place. So I'm going to, I probably have to share my screen to do this now, I guess. So let me just, okay. Is that showing up for everybody?
Yep.
You can see a browser.
Yeah, I can see the browser.
Brilliant. Okay. So this is the IUCN Red List website. Most of you are probably familiar with it. Certainly a number of you said there in the initial talks that you'd used it in the past 3 years. Obviously, the most simple way to use it and to interface with it is simply to type something into the search bar at top, just like you would with Google. That could be as simple as I hope you can see this.
Yeah, we can see that too.
Okay. So I just typed in painted lady. That immediately comes up with the results page, which you can see in a grid. You can see in a list if you want. You can also map them out. And of course, it just gives you if there's a picture available, it gives you a picture. But the key thing is obviously you click on that and it bounces you straight to the page where the species is listed. It gives you the details of who did the assessment. Actually, interestingly, this is one that was assessed very recently. It's got a 2020 date to it. You can see that it's least concern. And there's some basic information that is available right at the top of the page. This is actually in the throes of being redesigned for various reasons, mostly actually to accommodate the green status of species, but tells you a little bit about the population trend, gives you the distribution map, and you can scroll down and you can access all the information on taxonomy, assessment information, geographic range, etc., etc. So a whole suite of information quite easily accessible like that. Now, the reality is a lot of people they want something a bit more sophisticated than that. Usually when they go to the Red List website, usually they don't, they don't often have a species in mind. If you're an advanced user, you usually have something that's perhaps a little bit more nuanced in mind. And that's where the advanced search functionality kicks in. So if you click advanced, the website will crack open for you something that looks a little bit more akin to the sort of thing that you would see in an Amazon browser or something like that. And it allows you to basically run a series of filters on the left-hand side. So just to give you two very quick examples, we can go to land regions. We can pick Europe from the land regions, and we can scroll down, and we can just quickly pick out the United Kingdom. You can see there's a little number there that immediately tells you the 2,200 species on the red list that have been assessed for the United Kingdom. If we go back up, we can then go to taxonomy. We can filter down through the taxonomic groups, and we can say, well, actually, I'm interested in the arthropods. That tells you immediately there are 124 from the UK, or for which there are arthropods. And we can then go to red list category, and we can say, well, actually, I'm only interested in those that are threatened, critically endangered, and vulnerable. And that immediately pulls out a subset of species at the top, of which there are 12. Some of them, great, have photographs associated with them. Obviously, there are many species that don't have photographs associated with them. And that just gives you the ability to very quickly filter using those columns. You can obviously go absolutely mad. You can filter based on habitat type. You can filter on threats. You can do all sorts of things. You can even, using the map tab at the top, you can do you can open up a map tab, and you can do a spatially defined search where you can even use this little function over there, and you can draw a polygon, and the Red List website will return all of the species that are found within that polygon of distribution. And that can be quite useful if you're looking at quite a broad area, or an area that is at least smaller than one of the political or biogeographic units that are on the Red List. And of course, everything can be downloaded. You do have to create a login. You do need to create a login and sign up to the Red List website in order to be able to download data. But any search that you run or any query that you run, you can once you've created that login, you can download that information in CSV files and various other formats. You can download shape files, narrative text, all the rest of it. So the information is basically all there to be downloaded. There are some constraints over how the information can be used. There are some constraints, for example, over the use of data for commercial purposes. But for the most part, for all the purposes that you most commonly use it for, research and education and these kinds of things, there are absolutely no constraints with the use of Red List data for those purposes. So that is an extremely very quick tutorial of how the Red List website works. The functionality has changed quite a lot over the years. You can now look for things like endemic, so you can look for species that are endemic to particular countries. And of course, the functionality is constantly improving and changing over time, and will continue to do so. There are even assessments being allowed on the Red List website now in other languages. So you may occasionally see assessments in French and Portuguese and Spanish. So obviously, it's a case of things constantly adapting and changing. But there are some very good tutorials on the Red List website for both how to use the Red List website itself and the various tools and guidelines and protocols that it offers. So I'm aware there's probably 15 minutes. I think I'm going to stop sharing so that we've got some time to run through some questions, because I'm sure there will be a few. Let me just make sure.